Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Well, we'll be looking at COVID-19 and the impact on the US-China rivalry. Now, as many of you know, the geopolitical context between the US and China has often been described as the rivalry that will shape the 21st century. The global health crisis appears to have only fueled tensions between the world's two largest economies. And our speakers today are going to reflect on some of the short and long-term impact of the coronavirus on US-China relations. So with us today to discuss these issues is Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow with the Asia Research Institute with the National University of Singapore, Shui Wang, who's an Associate Professor with Leiden University, and James Crabtree, who's an Associate Professor at Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers. So I'm going to hand over to Kishore now, who will kick us off.
Thank you very much, Champa. I'll make 3 points to get the discussion going. The first point I'm going to make is that logically, when COVID-19 happened, it should have put a complete halt to the US-China rivalry, because one of the oldest rules of geopolitics is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, the enemy of in the case of the United States, the number one enemy today is COVID-19. COVID-19 is also an enemy of China. So if they had followed the oldest rule in geopolitics, US and China should be coming together to work together against COVID-19, and the whole world would have cheered if that had happened. But as you know, it didn't happen. And the question is, why didn't it happen? So that's my second point. It didn't happen because the US-China geopolitical rivalry has very deep roots. And as I document in my book, Has China Won? There are these 3 major structural forces driving it powerfully, and driving it powerfully right through COVID-19. So the first structural force, of course, is that for 2,000 years or more of geopolitics, whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is United States, you get rising geopolitical tension. That's happened for 2,000 years. That's the first structural factor. The second structural factor is that, of course, what makes it even more uncomfortable for the United States is that it may be overtaken not by a fellow Western power, but by a non-Western power. And that creates a lot of discomfort. You know, also some very deep cultural discomfort, especially since in the Western psyche, there's been buried for a long time what I would call the fear of the yellow peril. So there's an emotional dimension here that is driving this American reaction to the return of China. And we have to understand this emotional dimension because it explains why it overrides the logic of things like why not cooperate on COVID-19. And the third structural factor, of course, is that the United States has believed for a long time that if it engaged China and it opened up China economically, then logically, after China opens up economically, it will also open up politically, and China would become another fellow democracy like the United States. And indeed, some officials in the United States, like Kurt Campbell, have written eloquently about this in the magazine Foreign Affairs, explaining that that was the American expectation. But as you know, this didn't happen. Instead of China moving towards becoming a liberal democracy, actually it's quite comfortable with the system, and it's actually strengthening its own system. And that, as you know, has created a very strong sort of bipartisan disillusionment with China. And that's why, you know, when President Trump does anything, the Democrats oppose him. But when it comes to China, when he attacks China, the Democrats support him. And that's driven by this third structural factor, this disappointment with China. So my third and final point very quickly is that the big message that I hope we can all convey to the United States and China, especially those of us who live outside, is that none of us who are outside these 2 countries are very enthusiastic about these 2 countries going ahead with the geopolitical contest at a time when the rest of the world has got more pressing issues to deal with, global challenges to deal with, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's global warming. And so you will find that unlike in the first Cold War, where lots of countries were rushing in some ways to support the United States in the struggle against the Soviet Union, this time you notice that there's very little enthusiasm for it. And I hope that the rest of us, therefore, in the rest of the world, should therefore come together to persuade these two big elephants. Can you please set aside your differences for now and let us focus on our common challenges? Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore. James, turning now to you. I think Kishore's laid out some of the challenges in terms of, how the relationship has certainly hardened on both sides. But is it possible to avoid a so-called new Cold War? Isn't it inevitable that what you will see is that hedging strategies are doomed to failure, because certainly the US is going to want to see its allies take a stronger stance against China?
Thank you, Champa. Thank you, Kishore. It's nice to be here with you as well. Nice to be back at Chatham House. Let me say three things as well. This is always Kishore's style, so I'll copy him. The first of which is to talk about how China has mishandled the aftermath of the early stages of the pandemic. So in Kishore's book, which you can see on his shelf behind him, and which I would recommend, it's an excellent read, he begins by talking about the Chinese response to the 2008-9 financial crisis, and argues that China misplayed its hand in the aftermath of that crisis by misjudging America's response and being excessively aggressive in some areas. So, and I think the risk for China is it's in danger of doing that again in the aftermath of this crisis. There was a real opportunity, given the complete absence of American leadership in the aftermath of this crisis, for China to begin to play that kind of role internationally. Now, we can argue the toss about whether China wants to play that kind of role, but the opportunity was there to begin to play a more constructive role, both in terms of recovering from the pandemic and rebuilding the global economy. And it has chosen not to do that. In fact, it's chosen almost to do the opposite. It's pushed forward in various fronts in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, on the Indian border. And it now has to cope with what in many ways looks like a much more challenging international environment, not so much here in Southeast Asia, where I'm talking to you from, but certainly in the US, in the EU, in India. It's caused a quite robust response in some of these countries. You now have talk of a G11 summit meeting. Mr. Trump wants to have a D10 group of democracies. There's also, I think, a risk that this new style is raising nationalist expectations at home. Again, in Kishore's group, one of the things he praises President Xi for is being, in a sense, a good-minded technocratic leader who's going to keep nationalism under control. But now there's an expectation, I think, of China being able to throw its weight around abroad. And so on some of these tests on whether you can keep nationalism in check, I think China is in danger of overreaching itself in the aftermath of this crisis, which is a shame given it starts from a very strong position, both on an economic rebound and on the fact that it has managed this crisis much better than most other countries. The second point I wanted to make, however, is that the position in the US is, if anything, much more dangerous. I mean, we've seen over the last couple of days, and indeed the last few hours, the perilous situation on the streets across the United States. Kishore argues in his book that the US has no coherent strategy for dealing with China, which I think is absolutely right. I completely agree with his point about the emotional response of the way the US is handling this. But you now have a very dangerous situation in which you have a US president facing an election that he now looks pretty likely to lose. It's very hard to tell, it's very unstable, in which China is his only winning hand. And therefore the risk, I think, is very real that he provokes some kind of international process in order to win back domestic support. Hard to see exactly how that would play out, but it's certainly a very unstable situation. The third point I wanted to make briefly was about the notion of decoupling. I mean, I think that the pressure really is too great for the US and China, or the West and China, not now to begin a process of economic decoupling to some degree. That will happen partly on the corporate side as companies decide that they want to diversify supply chains, not necessarily reshoring to countries like the UK or America, but diversifying in other parts of Asia and other emerging markets. But there's also clearly political pressure to do this. And that will be not just medical equipment, but also pharmaceuticals, defense, a whole range of other areas. Now, you can ask whether this is wise. In some ways, it wouldn't have solved the problems that we faced during the pandemic. But I think to some degree, if there is going to be heightened political tension, geopolitical tension, then the degree of economic interdependence that we have between China and the West at the moment is basically unsustainable. The problem is that actually unpicking this very integrated two sets of economies is going to be very difficult, much more difficult than people realize, and it will create a whole new set of instability. So you asked about the Cold War. The problem with this Cold War is not that you have two separate blocks, but that you've got two deeply intertwined blocks. And I think in the West, people have not really begun to grapple with the economic cost that this process will bring, and also the complexities of trying to get companies out to some degree of different parts of Asia. I think it's something that people haven't begun to think about at all. So let me stop there. Those would be my 3 points, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, James. Turning now to you, Shui. As James was just talking about, decoupling is a real risk, and certainly lots of people are talking about how to be more self-sufficient. Many countries have started saying, you know, how can we be more self-reliant in terms of what we need? But also with China, we're likely to see an inward turn, aren't we, where they will want to also get their own domestic economy going. And what will then this mean in terms of their external economic engagement? How do you see this playing out in terms of how China is seeing the current situation?
Thank you, Champa. So as James has mentioned, and as some China watchers would have noticed, that the Chinese government has faced multiple challenges caused by the COVID-19 since the very beginning of this year. And the worsening of China-US relationship has made everything even more difficult, make the recovery, or some call struggle, or economic struggle, even more difficult. So I will be discussing two aspects of Chinese government's economic policy options facing this COVID-19 crisis and the US-China rivalry at the same time. So the first aspect refers to how Chinese government aims to secure China's position in the global trade system and the supply chain. So since the China-US trade war started in 2018, there have been concerns like, will the global manufacturing center be diverted away from China? How will China be able to remain one of the most important players in the global supply chain? So there were solid reasons behind this kind of concerns, right? Because if you look at China's growth pattern, the growth of China's export had slowed since 2008 already. And the proportion of export actually, the proportion of export in Chinese economy had declined already. And since 2018, Chinese exports to the US market had faced extra restrictions because of the Trump administration's decision on some of the punishment for the Chinese export sector. At the same time, China also faces competition from other manufacturing centers like Vietnam, like other Asian countries. And the COVID-19 created new challenges for the Chinese trade sector, because in the beginning, in the first 3 months, many Chinese factories stopped producing due to the pandemic. And once China started to resume production, then the external market started to weaken, and it continues to weaken, especially in the European and the US market. So what kind of implication do these challenges have for the Chinese policymakers? So first of all, I think if you look at the trade data, you see that China's trade with ASEAN countries and other Asian countries have not largely decreased. And the proportion of Chinese export to BRI countries in total Chinese export has actually increased. So this encourages China to strengthen the trade links with Asian neighbors and BRI countries. So the Chinese government has implemented a series measures to try to promote the using of renminbi in the region, and also for the companies, they have increasing incentives to customize to serve these new markets or rising markets. In the long run, China obviously still hopes to maintain a good trade relationship with the West, with Europe and US. Well, the current geopolitical environment makes everything very difficult, and that refers to what James mentioned about this decoupling, right? Decoupling in the short term especially. But I don't think there will be a complete decoupling between the two countries in the long run, because the US still expects China to buy more US goods. And that as part of the first stage deal, trade deal between China and US. And that wouldn't be possible if the Chinese economy is further isolated from the world. In the short and the medium run, the industrial chain will not move out of China because, well, China still has this agglomerative or combined effects in its manufacturing sector. And China is also one of the first to resume production during the COVID-19, which shows some of the advantage of Chinese economy, especially in the manufacturing sector. But in the long run, Chinese corporations need to accelerate industrial upgrading if it wants to remain one of the most important player in the global supply chain. And this requires China really to fix the bilateral relationship with the US, because the current US government tries to cut China off the globalization of technological innovation, which creates massive difficulties for the technological progress in China. Some are saying, oh, this, okay, China can develop technology, indigenous technology, but in today's world, it's not possible to really reach technological progress without connecting to the rest of the world. And at the same time, we will also see China makes extra effort to pursue technological collaboration with other countries in Asia and Europe. So first aspect is China's role in the global supply chain. The second aspect refers to China's effort in developing what's called a new infrastructure both in China and maybe in the future abroad. So a meeting of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China, Central Committee, in March, urged accelerating the development of new infrastructure projects. And the government aims for facilitating innovation and strengthening weak links in socio-economic development through this project. So what is new infrastructure projects? So very briefly, these projects include like a 5G network, ultra high voltage transmission, intercity high-speed railway, urban rail transit, new energy charging facilities for electric vehicles, big data center, AI, industrial, internet, etc. So the development of these new infrastructure projects has very important implications for the recovery of Chinese economy, especially under the US constraint and the COVID-19 crisis. So if you look at the three main driving forces of the Chinese economy, the consumption, export, and investment, you will see that in the forthcoming year, both the consumption and export might stay weak, especially the export that will depend on how the external market reacts. So the investment becomes a very important pillar of the Chinese economy, especially the investment in new infrastructure in contrast to in manufacturing or in real estate, because new infrastructure is different from traditional infrastructure. It should not contribute to overcapacity like the traditional infrastructure, especially what happened after 2009 stimulus policies of the Chinese government. And more importantly, the new infrastructure development is closely connected to technological innovation. And the government hopes to push forward technological development through the new infrastructure projects. This is especially important considering the technological competition between China and the US at the moment and in the forthcoming years. And beyond that, China can also has the potential to further extend these new infrastructure projects outward towards the BRI countries, which allows China to continue to build a strong economic network that does not directly rely on the US. So that's the second aspect, the development of new infrastructure in China and maybe later on abroad as well. So I will stop there.
But just turning now to all of you to kick things off, we've had many questions come in already. What do you see? Because what we see is this tension means a lack of international cooperation on some of the key issues of the day. But do you see a potential role here for middle powers? And what is it, which middle powers do you think could apply, whether it's upward pressure or through kind of engagement with both US or China in terms of fostering international cooperation? Because it seems at the moment we live in a very fragmented world where everybody's taking atomized approaches. So James, do you see a role here for middle powers in terms of what they could do to foster international cooperation. And one of the questions we've had asked, certainly if you look just at the Asia region, there's a lot of unease about the rise of China, not least because of some of its perceived bullying or its strong diplomatic tactics. Do you think there's a risk that China might have lost Asia?
I mean, almost the opposite, actually. I think if you look at where the reaction has been fiercest, then clearly the biggest change has come in Europe. The US was already very hawkish on China. Europe has had a real moment of conversion. You could put Japan in that category. But actually here in Southeast Asia, predominantly, you haven't seen very much of that. I mean, I think there's a mixture of sort of quiet admiration for how China has handled the crisis in terms of its pandemic response, which has clearly in most countries been much more competent than in Europe and North America. And that's true of rich countries like South Korea, and it's also true of middle-income countries like Thailand and Malaysia that have done pretty well. So you don't see that fierce backlash here. India is a different case. India has actually been much more similar to Europe and the US. Is there room for middle powers? Yes, there is. And in theory, this new world of the US and China scrapping with one another should give much more space to other countries. The problem is we haven't seen very much of that. So the places that you might look to, let's say the Western countries who believe in the multinational order, let's say Abe of Japan, or Mr. Macron in France, or Mrs. Merkel, or the European Union in general, they have either been too distracted or simply haven't been able to bring together the kind of coalitions that are necessary to do anything serious. And that's particularly the case when the US is playing such a destructive role under President Trump. So yes, in theory, it's possible to imagine middle powers playing a much greater role, but they certainly haven't been doing it over the last few months.
And turning now to Kishore, I mean, one of our audience members has asked, it seems that you're arguing for more US accommodation of Beijing. And while that might stabilize US-China relations, it would also cause perhaps consternation in Japan, perhaps Australia, and other countries that see China's rise with more suspicion. Don't you think that this would transform East Asia as China seeks to reshape the region to advance its own interests?
Well, I mean, I would make a big conceptual distinction between accommodation and being intelligent. And as you know, the fundamental problem in the United States' attitude towards China is that it has decided, as I say in my book, and Henry Kissinger gave me this insight, the United States decided to launch a geopolitical contest against China, the world's oldest civilization, without first working out a comprehensive geopolitical strategy on how you're going to manage this contest. And it's actually quite a shocking thing to do, and that explains the very erratic, irrational move. So what the attitude of many of American allies and friends over the world, they're actually, and you're right, they're very happy that the United States is standing up to China and being strong and all that. They appreciate all that. But sometimes they scratch their heads and they wonder, so what's the strategy? What are you trying to accomplish? So in move after move, I mean, take for example, this is I must emphasize, happened in Obama's time, right? China launches an Asian infrastructure investment bank. United States opposes it and calls on its allies to oppose it. And guess what? Germany, France, UK join it. And so that it shows, it's one example of it. But since then, as you know, under the Trump administration, things have got far, far worse. And I'm glad that the issue of decoupling has come up in this discussion, because this is not an abstract theoretical issue for all the neighbors of China who do so much trade with China, including, by the way, two of the United States' strongest allies, Japan and South Korea. Guess who the #1 trading partner is? China. And you want them to decouple from China? That's like committing almost economic suicide on their part. So what I'm not suggesting is that the United States engage in a policy of accommodation. I'm suggesting the United States should work out first a comprehensive, thoughtful, long-term strategy. And at the end of the day, what I'm advocating actually is that if you look at where the United States is today, especially if you see the riots in 75 cities, I mean, come on. That's the kind of United States you want to take on China? When George Kennan advised the United States at the beginning of the Cold War, if you're going to win a geopolitical contest, it depends at the end of the day on your domestic spiritual vitality inside your society. Where's that vitality in the United States? And the erratic United States that cannot control its developments at home, takes on China erratically, is destabilizing the world order. I can tell you that even the friends and allies of the United States in the region are hoping, or what they want to see is a United States that is firm and strong, but that is also intelligent and thoughtful in the way that it was when it started the Cold War. As you know, that's how it got a lot of allies and friends signing on board. And this time around, I go back to my very first point. Name me one country that is saying, I'm right behind you, count me in this battle against China. Name me one.
Shui, on that point, because, you know, as Kishore says, what's needed is intelligent politics, but it certainly seems to be in short supply these days. And I'm interested, you know, one of our audiences asked, even as China seeks to want to continue, you know, investment overseas through its BRI projects, it's likely, given the current hardening of mood towards China, that they will face pushback. Now, is there opportunity here actually for recipient countries to better shape conditions and make more sense for themselves, rather than just accepting Chinese loans because of, you know, a lack of other options? I think it's good. Do you not think that it will be a harder challenge for China to do its overseas economic engagement post-pandemic than it has been before? And surely its focus will be more on the domestic economy now.
Yes. So the short answer, yes, it will be more challenging. It will be more challenging, not only because of the pandemic, it will be challenging. So I will come back to that, because BRI projects have already faced some difficulties even without this pandemic. And with this pandemic at the moment, you will see, especially from the Premier Li Keqiang's government work report a week ago, you will see it is the shortest report in the recent decades. There is no GDP target. It looks very different from previous years. Yes, China has been talking about caring about quality than the quantity for years, but it's actually the first time they didn't set a clear goal for GDP growth. This shows that in the coming year, really, the target will be domestic recovery. And from the tone of the report, you would also realize it is serious, it is challenging, and the government really hopes to make sure the economy does recover. If you look at all the fiscal policies and monetary policies, it's all about helping consumers, helping families with difficulties, helping small companies. So yes, I think in the coming year, the focus will very much be domestic. They didn't talk in the report. They didn't say too much about BRI compared to previously. They didn't say much about US or Hong Kong, Taiwan. So first of all, the first point is it's a very domestic forward, domestic oriented. Secondly, if you look at a Belt and Road initiative, they already face multiple difficulties, both because of the political, economic situation in the host country, recipient countries, as well as because of sometimes problematic business planning from the Chinese company side. And the Chinese government has realized that, and in the recent years, they really talk about risk management. You have to have good risk management. They tell the state-owned enterprise, you have to think clearly, carefully, talk with the local actors, listen to the local actors, because coming back to your question, the local agency really matters. Right? How local agency perceive, how local agency react, how local agency adapt to the way Chinese companies, Chinese government-owned companies do business. So I think in the coming year, it will be a period for adjustment, both on the Chinese side as well as the recipient side. We probably want to see massive new projects in the BRI regions in the coming year, but after, if they recover from the pandemic, some of these projects will go on. Hopefully, we are going to see a better adjustment, better practices, behavior from both sides.
Thank you. James, we've talked a little bit about middle powers, but there's also groupings such as the G7, the G20, and in your opening remarks, you talked about recent developments where people are talking about an expanded G7, for example. Do you see the potential for new groupings that could emerge to tackle these global issues in a more cooperative spirit? Or is it inevitable that countries now will have to face a situation of either choosing or perpetual hedging between the two superpowers?
No, I mean, I think there will be more of these ad hoc groupings. This is what a multipolar world looks like. So you have, I mean, this idea of a D10 doesn't exist yet, although in the last week it's become popular in the UK. It was given some teeth by the fact that President Trump invited the 3 extra countries, South Korea, Australia, and India, to the upcoming G7, and then immediately ruined it by also inviting Russia, who now apparently is not coming. But you have the groupings like the Quad or the Quad Plus here in Asia, which, although they've not done very much so far, are kind of gradually becoming a little bit more interesting. And you will see more ad hoc groupings of countries as they try and cope with how to manage a world in which the United States is not playing the leadership role that it once played. But a lot of this comes down to China's behavior. That in a sense, the strength of these groupings will come down to how alarmed countries are about what China is doing. And so if China continues over the coming months and the next year or two to, in a sense, for whatever reason, either because it sees the United States as off balance or because it needs to shore up domestic legitimacy, or for some other reason, if China continues to push forward, as it has by testing India on the border, as it has in Hong Kong and in other areas, then you'll see a reaction from countries who are worried about that. And that could be Japan, Vietnam, Australia, India, the European countries. Now, whether the response is going to be coherent or well organized, I very much doubt. I mean, I think this is going to be a kind of slightly chaotic process of trying to work out which of these groupings might have some power and under what circumstances. But yes, I mean, I think you'll see a lot more of this. The question is, what will it amount to?
Yeah, it's interesting, just if you could expand a little bit on what you were saying about Hong Kong, what's happened with India and with Taiwan as well, because we've had a number of questions come in about this, whether it's going to impact China's standing. As you say, you know, there is some countries that see with admiration how they responded to the pandemic, perhaps not the early stages, but certainly later on in terms of containing transmission. And it seems, you know, not odd timing, but to kind of have these battles on multiple fronts, in a way, is not helping China position itself as a collaborative actor on the world stage.
No, it definitely isn't. I mean, in a sense, its actions in Hong Kong have been, in a rather gruesome way, helped greatly by the events in the US over the last 48 hours, because now China looks reasonable compared to what's going on the streets of the US. But if you look at the relationship between China and India, so it's very unclear exactly what's going on in the Himalayas and who's at fault. But nonetheless, the increase in the regularity of these border clashes, in a sense, speaks to the changing nature of the relationship between India and China. They're butting up against each other in all sorts of different ways. And as China pushes and tests, it just makes it that much more likely that a country like India will decide to do the same, that it will decide to say something nice to Vietnam or take a stand in the South China Sea. And that the relationships will become that much more conflictual, and a country like India or Australia or Germany or the UK will decide to speak out a little bit, as Australia did when it called for an investigation into the early stages of the pandemic, or the UK has done when it has opened up a pathway to citizenship for some hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong citizens. Other countries are going to become a little bit braver at stepping up to China if China becomes a little bit more aggressive. And that's a very dangerous process for the rest of the world, because you have no superpower in charge. You have what Ian Bremmer calls a geopolitical recession, in which no one's in charge anymore. And you have a dynamic that can create much more tension as countries butt up against one another.
Thank you. Kishore, one of the questions we've had in is around human rights in China. And isn't this a space where allies can come together to push for change? But it seems to me that what we're seeing is human rights violations happen across a wide range of contexts. But certainly the question that we have is human rights a particular angle through which countries can come together in order to kind of try and shape Chinese behavior?
Well, you know, I'm going to sort of inject a small statistic here, if you don't mind. Out of the 7.5 billion people in the world, 12% live in the West, 88% live outside the West. And I would say that the human rights agenda that you speak about, and it's a noble human rights agenda, and I think it's, I want to live in a world where there's greater respect for human rights. I don't want to have my fingernails pulled. Let me be very clear about that. But if you look at how the agenda is pushed, it's clearly pushed by the Western countries, not necessarily with the purpose of trying to help the victims of human rights, but to score points. And if you're looking for a good instrument to use to embarrass China, then clearly you bring up human rights. And I'll give you a concrete example. Everybody in the West is talking about how the Uyghurs are being detained in China and how terrible it is. The Muslims in China are being oppressed. And then, as you know, the Western countries come out with a resolution in the UN, and they come together, they all sign a letter condemning China on its treatment of Muslims. But what is really embarrassing about that is that not one Muslim country supports the West when it is talking about oppression of Muslims in China. And the question is why? I mean, don't the Muslims care for each other? Don't the Muslims worry about each other? And the answer, frankly, is that the Muslims can see this is just a point-scoring game. And, you know, when it comes to violations of human rights, and in my book, I raise a very awkward question, which is, if you look at it factually, statistically, has China killed more innocent Muslims, or has the West killed more innocent Muslims through wars in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and, you know, drone strikes, assassinations, and so on and so forth? So you're dealing, in a sense, with the 88% and the rest of the world have become far more intelligent, thoughtful, perceptive of all these issues. And when the West comes out with this sort of black and white crusade against China, and sure, certainly I would agree that certainly many of the points made are correct and wrong, and I agree with that. But I think when it is used as a political instrument, you will find that if you look at you know, as ambassador to the UN, right? The 193 countries in the UN, at the end of the day, you ask yourself a very simple question. You launch a human rights resolution. If it's only supported by the Western countries, it's pointless. It's an exercise that makes you feel good, but that doesn't do any good, doesn't change anything. And so I would suggest that perhaps the time has come for the West to exercise a bit more humility on issues of human rights. And if you really want to change countries, the experience I learned, you know, Kofi and I co-authored an article together on why sanctions don't work. Frankly, if you publicly name and shame and sanction countries, they don't change. But if you try and talk to countries and deal with them, actually, at the end of the day, you can get changes happening. So yes, we should continue to raise human rights issues, but you raise them thoughtfully, carefully, and with the goal of making changes in the situation, rather than to feel good and sit on the mountaintop and shout from the mountaintop.
Thank you. Shui, to bring you in now, because I think human rights is just one example of how there's been a hollowing out of the international architecture, whether it's around human rights or the international economic governance, or many of the other kind of institutions that we have, where in a way, perhaps we've taken them for granted. And what we've certainly seen with China is over the last 10, 15 years, gradually occupying more space within these institutions. Now, you can argue that these institutions were never really that representative anyway, because they represent the interests of those who created them in the first place. But what do you see? How do you think Chinese engagement through international institutions is likely to evolve post-pandemic? Do you think they will still want to see themselves in key positions, in key institutions? I mean, is there still going to be that level of investment there? Or do you think focusing on the domestic economy is going to mean a withdrawal of them from these international spaces?
That's an excellent question. Again, the short answer is I think China will continue to commit to these international institutions. So China has been quite active in some of these, not all international institutions, but in some international institutions. especially the ones, the economic institutions where China can see its own national interests matches the institutions' main objectives, such as the World Bank, such as the IMF. China wanted to be a more decision maker in international economic affairs because China is becoming more confident, China is becoming more experienced in these economic affairs, right? If you look at what China does with the AIB, with the NDB, and China's increasing effort in all kind of multilateral development banks. China is openly talk about the kind of practices China appreciates. The faster, the more efficient, less bureaucratic, more hardware, infrastructure focused projects which China thinks can bring real benefits for the poor, for the developing nations. So China is quite outspoken, China is active. So I think China will continue to play an important role in these institutions. A related topic in the discourse of international governance, global governance, international relations is, will China's engagement in this institution somehow overturn the Western-led liberal economic order? Judging from what China is doing in these new institutions and old institutions like World Bank and IMF, it doesn't seem like China has proposed something that is radically or fundamentally different from what the World Bank or IMF were already doing. Yes, the way China invests or does business has less they talk less about political conditions, but I think as China become more and more involved in the international community, China soon will not be able to avoid political problems anymore. China will probably have to be find a way to engage with the domestic politics of the countries they invest in or wherever they go to. So at this moment, I don't see, we haven't seen China radically challenge or overturn the existing system. And like I said earlier, at the moment, China is trying to recover. After the pandemic, I think for in the medium run, China will probably continue with what it is doing, basically be more involved in the international community to, first of all, to satisfy its own demand, its own needs, economic needs, but at the same time, try to benefit others as much as it can. What will happen in the far future, I think that will depend on how China's role in the international political sphere evolves, and also very importantly, how China manages its relationship with the US and other Western countries.
Turning to you now, James, one of the questions we've had in refers to, where do you think the US-China rivalry now leaves Europe? Europe has traditionally taken a balanced approach between the US and China. For example, if you look at how responses to Huawei, do you think Europe will now take a harder line towards China, or do you think they will continue to try and take a middle path?
Yes, no, I think they will. I think in a sense, the pandemic has been most clarifying for Europe above all. Europe has had a rather awkward kind of hedging position where it's historically been close to the US, but it, and in particular Germany, has had this enormously important trading relationship with China. And also Europe has hoped that China would become a partner on issues that Europe in particular cares about, not human rights, obviously, but climate change and a few other things that in a sense were European priorities. But I think you've seen a really sharp hardening of the European mood. That's partly to do with the pandemic. It partly predates it. You had a new paper that was put out by the European Commission last year, which for the first time described China as a strategic competitor. And so I think what you will get is a much tougher approach to China within Europe. So much more difficult for Chinese companies to invest, much more difficult for Huawei, for instance, a whole bunch of things that will make it harder for China to act within Europe. Not impossible. I mean, China's been very canny in the way that it split Europe down the middle by courting Eastern European countries and some Western European countries, including Italy. What I don't think Europe is yet ready to do, and the interesting question is whether they will do, is whether they will become more ambitious in what they want to do at the other end of Eurasia. So China does lots of things in Europe and Africa and everywhere else. Europe does almost nothing in Asia. And the question is, can Europe, with all of its divisions and all of its weaknesses, but all of its money, begin to play more of a role in Asia as the United States does? And I think that is the hanging question for Europe, as to whether or not they can get their act together and begin to be much more ambitious in the way that they project power around the other side of the world.
Thank you. And the final question, because we're coming to the end of our time, is to Kishore. Kishore, what do you think is likely to happen next? Are we looking at an escalation of tensions that ultimately might have security implications, could lead to armed conflict? Or do you see a future where tensions could be eased if certain things are done? So what do you think will happen, but what would you like to see happen?
Well, I think if they read my book, the problem will be solved. But it's actually more seriously, I predict that relations will definitely get worse within US and China, because it's like when geopolitical rivalry revs up. But I think after the pain is felt for a while, I think both sides will come to realize that there are much more intelligent options. And at the end of the day, if the primary goal of the United States is to improve the well-being of its people, and it should improve the well-being of its people now, look at how America is burning today. And if the primary goal of China is to improve the well-being of its people, then I think they can live together. And I think Wang Shui described brilliantly how China's focus is on economic development and improving its conditions. So I think there is definitely scope for US and China to work together, but the rest of us and the rest of the world have an obligation to push them in that direction, and I hope we will agree to do that.
Thank you, Kishore. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, so my apologies to everybody whose questions I wasn't able to get to, but I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our speakers for giving us such a lively, sharing their lively thoughts on the key issues of today. So we hope that you can join us soon. I'm sure this is a conversation that will still continue, but thank you to you all for joining us today.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.